I never imagined the moment my own daughter would humiliate me would happen over Sunday dinner. The roast was still warm, my grandchildren were laughing just minutes before, and then Lauren stood up, looked me straight in the eyes, and spat in my face, not in anger alone, but with something colder. Entitlement. Like she believed I deserved it. Like everything I had given her, the house, the money, my years, meant nothing. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. My daughter didn't just disrespect me. She thought she owned me. What she didn't know was, within a week I would take everything back. If this moment shocked you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Have you ever faced a moment where someone you loved crossed a line you could never forget? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories about family strength and hard truths resonate with you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. My name is Alice Bennett, and until recently, I believed I understood the difference between love and sacrifice. I'm 62 years old, a widow of 9 years, and for most of my life, I worked quietly as a bookkeeper in a small accounting firm just outside Chicago. Numbers always made sense to me. People, not always. My late husband, Daniel Bennett, used to say, Alice, money doesn't change people. It reveals who they were already trying to hide. Back then, I would smile and shake my head, thinking he was being a little too cynical. Daniel was practical, cautious sometimes to a fault. I was the softer one, the one who believed that if you loved hard enough, gave enough, showed up enough, things would work out. After he passed, that belief became my anchor. Our only daughter, Lauren Mitchell, had always been my world. When she was little, she would follow me around the house, holding on to the edge of my sweater, asking endless questions about everything. She had this bright, curious energy that made people smile instantly. Even as a teenager, when most kids pulled away, Lauren stayed close. We talked, we laughed, we leaned on each other. When her first marriage fell apart, I was there for every piece of it. Lauren had married young, too young if I'm honest. Her first husband, Eric Mitchell, wasn't a bad man, but they were never right for each other. By the time the divorce came, Lauren was emotionally exhausted, financially strained, and trying to raise 2 young children on her own. Ethan was just 8 at the time, and Sophie had barely turned 5. I remember the night she showed up at my door, suitcase in hand, eyes red from crying. I don't know what I'm going to do, Mom, she said, and without hesitation, I opened my home and my life to her again. For nearly 2 years, we lived together. I helped with the kids, cooked meals, paid bills when she couldn't, and slowly helped her rebuild. I didn't keep track of what I spent. I didn't expect anything in return. She was my daughter. That was enough. But eventually, I realized something important. Lauren didn't just need emotional support. She needed stability, a foundation she could stand on without constantly fearing it would collapse beneath her. That's when I decided to buy the house. It wasn't a small decision. I used a significant portion of my savings money Daniel and I had carefully set aside over decades. The house was modest but beautiful, located in a quiet suburban neighborhood with good schools and safe streets, a place where my grandchildren could grow up feeling secure. Lauren cried when I handed her the keys. I don't know how to thank you, she said, hugging me tightly. You don't have to, I told her. Just build a good life here. That's enough. And I meant it. What I didn't tell her, what I quietly handled on my own, was how the house was structured legally. You see, I didn't transfer ownership directly to Lauren. Instead, I placed the property under an LLC that I controlled. It wasn't about distrust. Not then. It was about protection. I had seen too many situations where assets became tangled in future relationships, debts, or legal complications. This way, the house would always remain secure for her and for the children. At least that was my intention. For a while, everything seemed to fall into place. Lauren found a new job, the kids adjusted to their new school, and life regained a sense of normalcy. I would visit often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit with the kids and help with homework. Ethan loved math just like I did. Sophie preferred drawing and would proudly show me her latest creations taped to the refrigerator. Those were good days. Then Lauren met Brandon Cole. At first, I wanted to like him. Truly, I did. He was confident, well-spoken, and attentive in a way that made Lauren feel seen again. After everything she had gone through with her divorce. I understood why that mattered. Brandon worked in consulting, though I never quite got a clear answer on what that actually meant. He dressed well, talked big, and carried himself like a man who always knew where he was going, even if you weren't entirely sure where that was. Mom? He's different, Lauren told me one afternoon, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. He understands me, and I wanted that to be true. But something about him unsettled me. It wasn't anything obvious. Not at first. It was in the small moments, the way he would glance around the house, not with appreciation but with assessment. The way he asked questions about property values, renovation costs, and neighborhood trends within days of meeting me. The way he spoke about upgrading things that didn't need upgrading. "This place has potential," he said once, standing in the living room with his hands in his pockets. "With the right investment, you could easily double the value." Lauren laughed, clearly impressed. "See, Mom? I told you he knows this stuff." I smiled politely. "It's already a good home." Brandon nodded, but there was a flicker in his eyes I couldn't quite place. "Calculation, maybe." Still, I pushed the feeling aside. Lauren deserved happiness. I wasn't going to be the kind of mother who found problems where there were none. They married less than a year later. At the wedding, everything looked perfect. Lauren was radiant. The children were dressed beautifully, standing proudly beside her. Brandon played the part of the devoted husband, flawlessly holding her hand, smiling for photos, thanking guests. And I remember thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was the fresh start she needed. But looking back now, I realized something had already begun to shift. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, steadily. And I didn't see it for what it was. Not yet. Because the truth is, the night my daughter spat in my face didn't start that night. It started long before. In the small changes I chose to ignore. In the words I brushed off. In the boundaries I never set. And by the time I finally understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it the easy way. If I could go back, I would pay closer attention to the small moments, because that's where it began, not with shouting, not with cruelty, not even with disrespect. It started quietly in ways that were easy to excuse if you loved someone enough. After Lauren married Brandon, the first change I noticed was subtle. She became busier, or at least that's what she called it. "I'll call you later, Mom," she would say, cutting our conversation short more often than usual. Later rarely came. At first I told myself it was normal. Newly married life, new routines, new priorities. I didn't want to be the mother who clung too tightly, so I gave her space. But space, I learned, has a way of turning into distance if you're not careful. When I visited the house, things felt different. Not dramatically, everything was still in its place, the same furniture, the same photos on the walls, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was tension underneath the surface. A kind of invisible current that made me feel like I was no longer walking into my daughter's home, but into someone else's territory. Brandon was always polite. That was the confusing part. "Good to see you, Alice," he would say, offering a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wasn't openly rude. He didn't raise his voice or say anything directly offensive. But there was a tone subtle controlled that made it clear I was no longer central to Lauren's life. I was peripheral. Lauren, on the other hand, began to change in ways I couldn't ignore. It showed up first in how she spoke to me in front of others. One afternoon, I stopped by with groceries, things I knew the kids liked, along with a homemade casserole. Ethan ran to hug me the moment I walked in, nearly knocking the bag out of my hands. "Grandma, you made the cheesy one I did." I laughed, steadying myself. But before I could say anything else, Lauren's voice cut through the moment. "Ethan, don't be so dramatic," she said, rolling her eyes slightly. Then she turned to me. "Mom, you don't have to keep bringing food. We're not struggling anymore." The words themselves weren't harsh, but the tone, the slight embarrassment, the way she glanced toward Brandon as if to confirm something stung more than I expected. I just thought I began. "We're fine," she interrupted a little too quickly. Brandon leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching the exchange. "She's right," he added casually. "We're trying to keep things balanced. Not rely too much on outside help." "Outside help?" I nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "Of course." But something inside me shifted. I had never thought of myself as outside in my daughter's life. Still, I told myself not to overreact. It was just one moment. But then there were others. Small comments, passing remarks, little corrections that chipped away at something deeper. At a birthday dinner for Sophie, I complimented the decorations Lauren had put together. "It looks beautiful," I said. "You've always had such a good eye." Lauren smiled briefly, then shrugged. "Well, Brandon helped me pick everything out. He's better with style than I am." Brandon chuckled. "I wouldn't say better, just more experienced." I noticed the way Lauren looked at him, admiring, almost eager for his approval, and suddenly my compliment felt misplaced, like I had praised the wrong person. Another time, during a gathering with a few of Lauren's friends, the conversation turned to finances. Someone asked how they managed to afford such a nice home in that neighborhood. Before I could even take a sip of my tea, Lauren laughed lightly and said, "Oh, we've had some help, but we're basically handling everything ourselves now." The way she said it, casual, dismissive, made it sound like whatever I had done for her was minimal, temporary, almost irrelevant. I stayed quiet, staring down at my cup. Brandon added, "It's important to stand on your own feet. Too many people get comfortable relying on family." A few people nodded in agreement. I felt something tighten in my chest. I wanted to speak, to remind them, to remind her of everything that had been given, everything that had been sacrificed. But I didn't, because I didn't want to embarrass her, because I still believed protecting her dignity was part of loving her. That was my mistake. The children thankfully hadn't changed. Ethan still asked me for help with his math homework whenever I visited. He would sit beside me at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, brow furrowed in concentration. "Grandma, is this right?" he'd ask, sliding the paper toward me. And I would lean in, explaining step by step, just like I used to with Lauren when she was his age. Sophie, on the other hand, would tug on my sleeve and drag me to her room, eager to show me her drawings. "This one's you," she said once, holding up a picture of a woman with short gray hair and a big smile. "You're holding my hand." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Those moments kept me grounded. They reminded me of why I stayed, why I kept showing up even when something inside me whispered that I was no longer truly welcome. But the turning point came one evening I wasn't supposed to hear. I had stopped by unannounced, not something I usually did, but I had been in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop off a few things for the kids. The house was quiet when I arrived, but I could hear voices from the living room. Lauren and Brandon. I paused near the doorway, not intending to eavesdrop, but then I heard my name. "She's still holding on to it," Lauren was saying. Her voice edged with frustration. "I don't understand why she won't just transfer the house already." Brandon let out a short laugh. "Because she thinks it gives her control." "It's ridiculous," Lauren snapped. "It's my house. I live here. My kids live here." There was a brief silence. Then Brandon said something that made my stomach drop. "She's not going to let go unless you push her." "What does that mean?" Lauren asked. Another pause. Then in a tone so casual it chilled me. "It means you stop treating her like your mother and start treating her like what she is." "And what's that?" Lauren asked quietly. Brandon exhaled. "A resource." The word hung in the air like something heavy and irreversible. I stood frozen, my hand still resting lightly against the doorframe. Lauren didn't protest. She didn't laugh it off. She didn't defend me. Instead, after a moment, she said softly, "I don't want it to get ugly." Brandon's reply came quickly. "It won't if she cooperates." Something inside me cracked then. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough for me to finally see what I had been refusing to acknowledge. This wasn't just a phase. This wasn't just stress or adjustment or influence. This was a shift in how my daughter saw me. Not as her mother, not as the woman who had held her through heartbreak and rebuilt her life piece by piece, but as something useful, something to be managed, controlled, used. I stepped back quietly, careful not to make a sound, and walked out before they knew I had ever been there. I sat in my car for a long time after that, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes unfocused, trying to process a truth I wasn't ready to accept. Because deep down, I knew something then that I couldn't unknow. The respect was gone. And once respect disappears, love doesn't stand a chance without it. I just didn't realize yet how far things were about to go. The invitation came 3 days later. Sunday dinner at our place, Lauren texted. "Just family. I think it's time we all reset." I stared at the message longer than I should have. Reset. It was such a gentle word for something that felt anything but gentle. For a moment I considered declining. I still hadn't fully processed what I'd overheard. That single word resource kept echoing in my mind, attaching itself to every memory I had of my daughter lately. But then I thought about Ethan and Sophie. I thought about how children notice everything even when they don't understand it. The last thing I wanted was for them to feel caught in the middle of something they couldn't fix. So I replied simply, "I'll be there." Sunday arrived colder than expected for early spring in Illinois. The kind of gray, quiet day where the sky feels heavy like it's holding something back. I spent the morning cooking. Roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes the way Ethan liked extra creamy, and Sophie's favorite baked macaroni with the golden crust on top. I told myself it wasn't about fixing anything, but maybe deep down I still believed that food could soften what words had hardened. When I arrived, the house looked exactly as it always had. The porch light was on even though it was still daylight. The wind chimes near the door moved gently with the breeze. For a brief second, standing there with the casserole dish in my hands, I let myself imagine that everything inside would feel normal again. That illusion lasted about 5 seconds. Brandon opened the door. "Alice," he said, stepping aside to let me in. His smile was polite, practiced. "Glad you made it." "I said I would," I replied, keeping my tone even. Inside, Lauren was already at the dining table, adjusting the placement of the silverware. She looked up when I walked in. "Hi, Mom." Not Mom the way it used to sound. Just a word. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, placing the dish on the kitchen counter. Ethan and Sophie ran in from the living room the moment they saw me wrapping their arms around my waist. "Grandma?" "You came," Sophie beamed. "Of course I did," I said softly, brushing a hand over her hair. Ethan glanced between me and his mother as if measuring something he couldn't quite name. Dinner began with small talk, safe topics, school updates, weather. A brief mention of a neighbor's new dog. Chloe Sanders Lauren's friend was there, sitting to her right, sipping wine like she belonged at the table. Derek Cole Brandon's younger brother leaned back in his chair with a casual indifference that felt almost rehearsed. I hadn't expected them. I should have. Nothing about this felt like a quiet family dinner. It felt staged. The first 20 minutes passed without incident. I almost allowed myself to relax. Maybe, just maybe, I had misread things. Maybe this really was an attempt to move forward. Then Brandon set his glass down. "So, Alice," he said, his tone light but deliberate. "We've been meaning to talk to you about something." There it was. I placed my fork down carefully. "What is it?" Lauren exchanged a quick glance with him before speaking. "It's about the house." Of course it was. I felt my spine straighten slightly, though I kept my expression calm. "What about it?" "Well," she began, folding her hands together, "we've been thinking it might be time to make things official." "Official," I repeated. Brandon leaned forward. "Transfer the deed. Put it in Lauren's name. It just makes things cleaner." Cleaner. I let the word sit in the air for a moment. "The current arrangement is already clear," I said. "The house is secure. You and the kids have stability. That was the goal." Lauren's jaw tightened slightly. "But it's not really ours," she said. "Not fully." "You live there," I replied. "That hasn't changed." "That's not the point," she snapped, her voice sharper now. Ethan shifted in his seat. Sophie went quiet. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. "Then what is the point?" I asked gently. Lauren exhaled, clearly trying to maintain control. "The point is, Mom, you're still involved in everything. The bills, the decisions, it's like we can't fully move forward because you're always in the background." "In the background?" I repeated, disbelief creeping into my voice. Brandon stepped in again. "She doesn't mean it like that," he said smoothly. "It's just about independence. You've done a lot for Lauren, we appreciate that, but at some point you have to let go. Let go." I looked at him, then back at my daughter. "I haven't stopped you from living your life," I said. "But the house was never meant to be a blank check. It was meant to protect you." Lauren laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Protect me." From what I hesitated. From exactly this. But I didn't say it. Instead I said, from uncertainty. From losing everything if something goes wrong. "Nothing is going wrong," she shot back. "You're just controlling." The word hit harder than I expected. "Controlling." I glanced at Ethan. His eyes were fixed on his plate. Sophie was twisting her napkin in her hands. "I'm not trying to control you," I said quietly. "I'm trying to make sure you're safe." "I don't need you to keep me safe," Lauren snapped. "I'm not a child." Silence fell over the table. Then Brandon spoke again, his tone colder now. "Let's be honest, Alice. The house is essentially Lauren's. You just haven't made it official yet." I felt something inside me go still. "No," I said, my voice steady. "It isn't." Lauren's head snapped up. "What did you just say?" "The house is not yours," I repeated. "It's under my LLC. That was always the agreement." Her face flushed instantly. "Are you serious right now?" she demanded. "I've always been serious about protecting what I built," I replied. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Derek looked suddenly more interested. Lauren stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is unbelievable," she said, her voice shaking. "After everything, you're still holding this over me." "I'm not holding anything over you," I said. "I'm maintaining what was already in place." "You're controlling my life," she shouted. "I'm protecting my assets," I answered. That was the moment everything broke. Lauren stared at me, really stared, as if seeing me for the first time. Not as her mother, but as an obstacle. And then before I could react, she stepped forward. It happened so fast, and yet it felt like time slowed down. I saw her face twist, not just in anger, but in something deeper. Resentment. Entitlement. Something that had been building for a long time. And then she spat. Right into my face. The room froze. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply sat there feeling the warmth of humiliation slide down my cheek, the weight of the moment pressing into my chest. Ethan gasped. "Mom," he started, his voice cracking. Sophie began to cry softly. Brandon didn't say a word. Not one. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I reached for my napkin slowly, deliberately, and wiped my face. Then I stood up. No yelling. No tears. No scene. I looked at my grandchildren. "It's okay," I said gently, though my voice felt far away even to me. "This isn't your fault." Then I turned to Lauren. For a brief moment, I searched her face for something, anything resembling regret. There was none. Only defiance. Only certainty. That I would forgive her, like I always had. She had no idea that this time would be different. Without another word, I picked up my purse and walked out. And as the door closed behind me, I realized something with absolute clarity, that dinner hadn't been about reconciliation. It had been a test, and my daughter had just failed it in the worst possible way. What she didn't know was that I had just made a decision that would change everything. I don't remember the drive home. I remember starting the engine. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. But everything in between, the streets, the traffic lights, the turns I must have taken out of habit, blurred into nothing. What I do remember is the silence. A kind of silence that doesn't just sit around you, but presses into you. Heavy, unavoidable. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were trembling. I sat there for a long moment staring at the front of my house, the house Daniel and I had shared for over 30 years, the house where Lauren grew up, where she had scraped her knees, cried over her first heartbreak, laughed until she couldn't breathe. And tonight, I had just walked away from her, not as a mother leaving after dinner, but as a woman who had just been humiliated in a way that couldn't be undone. I stepped inside, slowly closing the door behind me with more care than usual, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little control I had left. I didn't go to the bathroom right away. I didn't wash my face. Instead, I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, still in my coat, my purse resting beside me. And then it hit me. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in waves. The image replayed in my mind, the look in Lauren's eyes, the way she didn't hesitate, the way she didn't flinch afterward. And something inside me broke. I leaned forward, covering my face with my hands, and for the first time since it happened, I cried. Not just for the humiliation, not just for the disrespect, but for the realization that the daughter I thought I knew might not exist anymore. I cried for the years I had given without question, for the nights I stayed up worrying about her, for the choices I made to protect her even when she didn't understand them. And most of all, I cried for the version of myself who believed that love alone could keep everything from falling apart, because it couldn't. Eventually, the tears stopped. Not because the pain disappeared, but because something else took its place. Clarity. I stood up slowly and walked to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror as I washed my face, watching the water carry away the last physical trace of what had happened. But the feeling, that would take longer. When I returned to the living room, I didn't sit down again. Instead, I walked toward the small desk in the corner, the one where I kept my files, my records, the things I had always organized with quiet precision. Daniel used to tease me about it. "You run your life like a ledger," he'd say with a smile. Maybe he was right, because that night I did exactly that. I sat down, opened my laptop, and began to review everything. The house, the accounts, the documents I hadn't looked at in months because I trusted that things were stable. At first it felt almost mechanical. Numbers, dates, transactions, familiar territory, safe territory. But then, the patterns started to emerge. Small things at first. An invoice I didn't remember approving. A repair cost that seemed slightly inflated. A payment routed through an account I didn't recognize. I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. That wasn't right. I opened another file. Then another. And slowly, the sense of unease I had been ignoring began to take shape. There were emails requests for authorization that looked like they had come from me. Except, I hadn't written them. I knew my own phrasing, my own tone. These were off, subtly but unmistakably. My chest tightened. I clicked through the attached documents. Renovation proposals, contractor agreements, vendor payments, all tied to the property, all approved under my name, but not by me. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. This wasn't just disrespect. This was something else, something deliberate, something calculated. I reached for my phone. My hand hesitated for just a second before I dialed. Margaret Hayes, a calm professional voice, answered. "Margaret." I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's Alice Bennett. I need your help." There was a brief pause. "Alice." "Of course, what's going on?" I exhaled slowly. "I think something isn't right with the house." "Tell me," she said. And I did. Not everything. Not yet, but enough. Enough for her tone to shift from polite concern to focused attention. "Send me everything you have," she said after a moment. "Every document, every email, every transaction you're unsure about. Don't confront anyone yet. Just gather the information." "I understand," I replied. "And Alice," she added gently, "if this is what it sounds like, we'll handle it properly." Properly. The word grounded me. After we hung up, I sat there for a long moment staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to close the laptop, to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen any of it. Because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. But I didn't walk away. I leaned forward again, and I kept digging. Hours passed. The house grew quiet around me. And with every file I opened, every number I verified, the picture became clearer and worse. By the time I finally closed the laptop, it was nearly 2 a.m. I sat there in the dim light, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. And for the first time since that dinner, I wasn't thinking about the spit. I wasn't thinking about the humiliation. I was thinking about something far more dangerous. Betrayal. Not just emotional, but financial, deliberate, planned, and possibly ongoing. I stood up slowly, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. Daniel's voice echoed in my memory. Money doesn't change people. It reveals them. I used to think he was too harsh. Now, I wasn't so sure. I walked toward the window and looked out into the dark street, the quiet neighborhood unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed, because the woman who walked out of that dinner was not the same woman standing here now. That woman still believed she could fix things. This one was starting to understand that some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be faced. And if necessary, taken back. The next morning, I didn't feel rested. I felt sharpened. There's a difference. Rest makes you softer, steadier. Sharpening. It cuts away hesitation. It leaves you with something clearer, but also colder. I made my coffee the way I always did, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, but I barely tasted it. My mind was already back inside the numbers, the documents, the inconsistencies that had kept me up most of the night. At exactly 9 o'clock, my phone rang. "Good morning, Alice," Margaret Hayes said. "I've reviewed what you sent over," and I asked, standing by the kitchen window watching a neighbor walk their dog as if the world hadn't shifted beneath my feet. There was a brief pause. "You were right to call me," she said. "There are irregularities." "Several." I closed my eyes for a moment. Hearing it confirmed didn't bring relief. It made it real. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Bad enough that you need to stop thinking of this as a misunderstanding," she replied. "We're looking at unauthorized financial activity, potential fraud, and possibly identity misuse." My grip tightened around the phone. "Are you saying someone forged my authorization?" I asked. "I'm saying the emails appear to originate from your account, but the language patterns, timestamps, and routing suggest they were not written by you," Margaret said. "We'll need a forensic review to confirm, but I'm confident enough to advise immediate protective action." My heart began to beat faster, not from panic, but from a growing controlled anger. What kind of action, I asked? First, freeze any discretionary payments tied to the property. Second, revoke informal permissions, access to accounts, communication channels, anything not formally documented. Third, she paused. "We need to understand motive." I let out a slow breath. "I think I already do," I said quietly. "Tell me." I hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I overheard a conversation. Lauren and Brandon. He called me a resource." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Margaret said, "That aligns with what I'm seeing." My stomach turned. "Keep going," I said. "There are renovation payments routed through third-party vendors that don't match market rates," she continued. "Some of the companies appear legitimate on the surface, but when you dig deeper, they're either recently established or linked to personal contacts." "Personal contacts," I repeated. "Yes, one of them is tied to a Chloe Sanders." My chest tightened. Chloe, Lauren's friend, the one who had been sitting at the dinner table sipping wine like she belonged there. "That's not a coincidence," I said. "No," Margaret agreed. "It's not." I moved to the table and sat down slowly. "How much?" I asked. "A preliminary estimate," she said. "Tens of thousands, possibly more depending on how far back this goes." I closed my eyes again. Not because of the money, but because of what it represented. "How long?" I asked. "Several months," she said. "Maybe longer." I let that sink in. This hadn't started recently. This wasn't a reaction to one argument, one bad night, one emotional outburst. This was a pattern, a system, a plan. Margaret. I said, my voice steady now. I need you to look into something else. Go ahead. The college fund. There was a brief pause as she pulled up additional files. Give me a moment, she said. I waited, staring at the grain of the wooden table, tracing the lines with my eyes as if they might anchor me. Then she spoke again. Alice. The tone in her voice told me everything before she even finished the sentence. There have been withdrawals. My heart dropped. How much I asked barely above a whisper. Not everything, she said, but enough to be concerning. Several transfers over the past 4 months. Small amounts at first, then larger. I felt something inside me fracture again. Not cleanly this time. Jagged. Uncontrolled. That fund was for Ethan and Sophie, I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to hold it steady. She knows that. I know, Margaret said gently. She knows that, I repeated louder now, because that was the part I couldn't reconcile. Money tied to me, that was one thing, but money meant for her own children. That suggests either desperation or a belief that it would be replaced before anyone noticed, Margaret said carefully. I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Or both, I said. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Margaret spoke again. There's one more thing you should hear, she said. I braced myself. I found a series of messages, partial records not complete but enough to establish intent. She continued. They reference the property structure, specifically the fact that it's under your LLC. My breath caught. What do they say? I asked. They indicate awareness, Margaret said. Lauren knew the house wasn't legally hers. The room seemed to tilt slightly. She knew I repeated. Yes. And Brandon? I asked. He's the one pushing the strategy, Margaret said, but Lauren is not uninformed. Not uninformed, complicit. I pressed my hand against my forehead, trying to steady myself. Read it to me, I said. There was a soft rustle of papers. We just need to get her to loosen control. Margaret read. If she signs anything even partial, we can leverage the rest later. She won't say no if it gets emotional. I felt my chest tighten. There was more. She's old Lauren. You have to stop treating her like she's in charge. You're the one living there. I swallowed hard. And Lauren? I asked quietly. Margaret hesitated. Then she continued. I don't want to fight her, but I'm tired of feeling like it's not really mine. The words landed like a weight I couldn't lift. Because they weren't cruel, they weren't angry, they were rationalized, justified. That was what made them worse. She believed it, I said. Yes, Margaret replied. I sat there for a long time after that. Long enough for the coffee in my cup to go cold. Long enough for the reality of it all to settle into something solid and undeniable. This wasn't just Brandon manipulating her. This wasn't just a bad influence. This was my daughter making choices. Conscious ones. Choices that involved deception. Choices that involved taking from her own children. Choices that involved turning me into something less than a mother. I stood up slowly and walked back to the window. The same neighbor was now walking back the other way, their dog trotting happily beside them. Normal. Everything looked so normal. How do you want to proceed? Margaret asked gently. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, there was still a part of me that wanted to believe there was a way back. A way to confront her, to make her see, to fix what had been broken. But then I thought about the dinner, about the spit, about the way she hadn't even flinched, and I realized something. She had already crossed a line, not in anger, but in belief. She believed she was justified, and you can't fix someone who believes they're right. I turned back toward the table. "When can we initiate action?" I asked. Margaret didn't hesitate. Immediately she said, "Good," I replied, because for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. And that decision came with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. If she wants to treat me like a resource, I said quietly, then it's time she learns what happens when the resource disappears. There was a pause. Then Margaret said, "I'll prepare everything." I ended the call and stood there in the quiet of my home. No tears, no hesitation, just a calm, steady understanding of what needed to be done, because love had brought me to this point. But truth was going to carry me the rest of the way. I didn't sleep that night either. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind refused to slow down. Every piece of information Margaret had uncovered kept rearranging itself in my head, forming a picture that was no longer blurry, no longer uncertain. It was clear, painfully clear. And once clarity settles and something inside you changes, you stop asking why and you start asking what now. By morning, I had my answer. At exactly 8:30 a.m., I sat at my desk with a notepad, a pen, and a list. For most of my life, lists had been my way of creating order out of chaos. Tasks, numbers, deadlines, things I could control. This time the list was different. It wasn't about organizing my day. It was about reclaiming my life. I wrote slowly, deliberately. 1. Freeze discretionary accounts. 2. Revoke all informal access. 3. Review property clause. 4. Initiate sale. The last line lingered on the page longer than the others. Initiate sale. Even now writing it made my chest tighten. That house wasn't just a property. It held years of memories, Lauren's laughter, the children's milestones, the fragile sense of stability I had worked so hard to create for them. Selling it felt final. But then I reminded myself of something Margaret had said. This is no longer a misunderstanding, and I understood what that meant. This wasn't about preserving memories. This was about confronting reality. I picked up the phone and called Margaret. "I'm ready," I said. There was no hesitation in my voice. "I thought you might be," she replied. "I've prepared the documents. Walk me through it." We spent the next hour going over everything in precise detail. The property held under my LLC included a Clause 1 I had insisted on when I first purchased the house. It allowed me to terminate occupancy if there was evidence of financial misconduct, unauthorized use of funds, or actions that put the asset at risk. At the time, it had felt like a formality. Now it was protection. "You have legal standing," Margaret confirmed. "More than enough." "And the notice?" I asked. "It will be formal," she said. "Clear. Direct. They'll have a defined period to vacate, but given the circumstances, we can expedite the process." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "Do it," I said. There was a brief pause on the line. Alice Margaret said gently, "Once this starts, there's no quiet way to undo it." "I know," I replied. And I did. Because this wasn't just a legal action, it was a line being drawn. After we ended the call, I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall for a moment. Then I reached for my laptop again. There was more to do. If I had learned anything from the past few days, it was this: loose ends create openings. And I was done leaving openings. I logged into every account connected to the property. Email access, payment authorizations, Vendor communications. One by one, I changed passwords, removed permissions, and documented everything. It was methodical work, precise, controlled. But underneath it all, there was something else building. Not rage, not even anger. Something quieter. Resolve. Around midday, my phone buzzed. Lauren. I stared at her name on the screen. For a brief second, I considered ignoring it. But then I answered. Hello? Her voice came through sharp and impatient. Mom, what's going on? I kept my tone neutral. What do you mean? I mean the account, she snapped. I tried to process a payment this morning and it was blocked. Everything's locked. Did you do that? Yes, I said. There was a pause. Then, why? The question was almost laughable. But I didn't laugh. Because they're my accounts, I replied. That's not an answer, she shot back. It's the only one you need, I said calmly. Her breathing quickened slightly. Are you serious right now? She demanded. After everything, you're just going to shut us out? After everything! The phrase echoed in my mind. Yes, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. You're overreacting, she said finally. It was one argument, Mom. One night. I closed my eyes briefly. One night, I repeated. Yes, she said, her voice rising. You're acting like I committed some kind of crime. I didn't respond right away, because the truth was, she didn't see it. Not really. To her, the dinner had been a moment. A mistake, maybe, but not a turning point. To me, it had been the final confirmation of something much deeper. This isn't about one night, I said quietly. Then what is it about, she demanded. I thought about the emails, the forged authorizations, the withdrawals from the children's fund, the conversation I had overheard. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. It's about patterns, I said instead, and consequences. She let out a sharp, frustrated sound. God, you always do this, she said. You make everything bigger than it needs to be. No, I replied. I've been making everything smaller than it actually is. For years. That stopped her. For a moment there was silence. Then she spoke again, her tone shifting less aggressive, more calculated. Look, she said, if this is about the house, we can talk about it. But locking us out like this, that's not fair. Fair. The words settled heavily between us. Fair would have been honesty, I said. What does that mean? She asked quickly. It means, I replied, that I'm no longer comfortable with how things have been handled. That's so vague, she snapped. What are you even accusing me of? I didn't answer, because I wasn't ready to confront her with the full truth. Not over the phone. Not like this. You'll receive a formal notice, I said instead. There was a beat of silence. A notice, she repeated. Yes. For what she asked, though, I could already hear the tension creeping into her voice. I took a breath. For the property, I said. I'm initiating a sale. The reaction was immediate. What she shouted. The house will be listed. I continued, my voice steady. You'll be given the appropriate timeline to vacate. You can't be serious, she said, disbelief flooding her words. That's our home. No, I said quietly. It isn't. The silence that followed was different this time. Not just shock. Something sharper. You're unbelievable, she said finally. You're actually doing this. Over nothing? I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to explain. You're going to regret this, she added, her voice cold now. Maybe I said, but not for the reasons you think. She hung up. The line went dead, and just like that, It had begun. I set my phone down slowly and leaned back in my chair. My heart was steady. My hands were still. There was no rush of adrenaline, no second guessing, just a quiet, unshakable certainty, because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't reacting to what my daughter needed. I was responding to what was right. And if that meant tearing down something I had built with love, then so be it, because some things aren't meant to last. Not when they're built on the wrong foundation, and this one had been cracking for longer than I ever wanted to admit. By the next day, the story had already changed. Not the truth, the story. It always amazes me how quickly reality can be reshaped once it leaves your hands and passes through someone else's mouth. Facts become suggestions, intent becomes accusation, and suddenly you're no longer the person who acted, you're the villain in someone else's version of events. I learned that the hard way. It started with a phone call from my sister-in-law, Carol. "Alice," she said without greeting, "what on earth is going on with you and Lauren?" I leaned back in my chair, already understanding what that meant. "What have you heard?" I asked. A brief pause. "She says you're trying to throw her out of her own home," Carol replied. "That you've been controlling her for years, and now you've finally gone too far." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Of course. That's not accurate," I said calmly. "Well, that's what she's telling people," Carol continued. "She's very upset. She said you locked her out of the accounts and are punishing her over a disagreement." A disagreement. The phrase settled like dust over everything that had actually happened. "I see," I said quietly. Carol sighed. "Look, I'm not taking sides. I just think maybe this has gotten out of hand. She's your daughter, Alice. Families fight. Families fight. Yes, but families don't always betray." "I appreciate your concern," I said, keeping my tone measured. "But there's more to this than you've been told." "Well, then maybe you should talk to her," Carol said, "before this turns into something worse." Before. As if it hadn't already. "I will handle it," I replied. When the call ended, I sat there for a long moment staring at my phone. It had begun. The narrative shift, and I knew it wouldn't stop there. By the afternoon, 2 more relatives had reached out. One texted, the other called. Different words, same message. "Lauren is hurt. Lauren is confused. Lauren doesn't understand why you're doing this." Not one of them asked what had happened at that dinner. Not one of them questioned why I would suddenly take such drastic action. Because Lauren had already given them an answer. And people tend to accept the first version they hear, especially when it's wrapped in emotion. I didn't correct them. Not yet. Because I knew something they didn't. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs time. Still, I won't pretend it didn't hurt. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being misunderstood, not by strangers but by people who have known you for years. People who should recognize your character well enough to question a story that paints you as something you're not. But they didn't. And that told me something too, that perhaps I had spent so many years being the one who kept the peace, that no one had ever really seen what it cost me. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Ethan. I stared at his name for a moment before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." "Grandma?" His voice was small. "Careful." "Yes, I'm here." There was a pause on the line. "Are you mad at Mom?" he asked. The question landed softly, but it carried weight. I closed my eyes briefly, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not mad at you or Sophie," I said. "You both did nothing wrong." "I know," he said quickly, "but Mom said you're trying to take our house away." There it was, not just among adults. Even the children were being drawn into it. I felt my chest tighten. "Ethan," I said gently, "sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions. That doesn't mean I don't love you." Another pause. "Are we going to have to move?" he asked. The vulnerability in his voice cut deeper than anything else had. "Yes," I said softly, "at some point. But I promise you, you will be okay. I will make sure of that." "How?" he asked. I hesitated, because the truth was, I hadn't figured out all the details yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. "I'm working on it," I said, "and I will not let anything happen to you or Sophie. Do you understand?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Okay." Not because he fully believed it, but because he wanted to. "I love you," I added. "I love you too, Grandma," he replied. When the call ended, I sat there with the phone still in my hand. That was the moment the situation shifted again, because until then it had been about me and Lauren, about betrayal, about boundaries, about truth. But now, it was about the children, and that changed everything. I couldn't let them become collateral damage in a conflict they didn't create. I stood up immediately and walked to my desk. Within minutes, I was on the phone with Margaret again. "We need to talk about the kids," I said. I was expecting that she replied. "I want something set up," I continued. "A protected arrangement. Funds allocated specifically for them, education, living expenses, something their mother can't access." "That's possible," she said. "We can create a structured trust, controlled disbursements, third-party oversight." "Do it," I said without hesitation. There was a brief pause. "Alice," Margaret said carefully, "this will send a message." "I know," I replied. "And Lauren won't like it." I let out a slow breath. "She doesn't have to like it," I said. "She just has to live with it." We spent the next hour discussing details, legal structures, safeguards, timelines. It was complicated but not impossible. And with every decision, I felt something settle inside me. Not peace, not yet, but direction. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. Then, without thinking too much about it, I opened my laptop again. There was one more thing I needed to revisit. The messages. The ones Margaret had mentioned. The ones that proved intent. I scrolled through the files she had sent. Partial transcripts, timestamps, fragments of conversations. And then I found it. A line I hadn't fully processed before. "If she won't give it to us willingly, we'll make her feel like she has no choice." I stared at the screen, reading it once, then again, and something inside me shifted. Because suddenly, the dinner made sense. The setup, the pressure, the humiliation. It hadn't been random. It had been strategy. Push her emotionally, destabilize her, make her react. And if I had reacted the way they expected, if I had yelled, lashed out, lost control, they would have had exactly what they needed. Proof, leverage, a reason to paint me as unstable, to challenge my judgment, my competence, my ownership. I leaned back in my chair, my heart beating slowly but steadily. They hadn't just underestimated me, they had planned for a version of me that no longer existed, and that was their mistake. Because I hadn't given them what they wanted, I hadn't reacted, I had observed, and now I was responding, carefully, deliberately, completely. I closed the laptop and stood up, walking toward the window once more. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Everything looked calm, ordinary, But beneath that calm, something irreversible had already begun, because the story Lauren was telling the world was about to meet the truth. And the truth doesn't just defend itself. It exposes everything standing in its way. The first time I felt something close to relief, it surprised me. Not because things had gotten easier, but because for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. Her name was Rachel Bennett, my late husband Daniel's niece. 34 years old, sharp-minded, composed, and far less sentimental than I had ever been. She worked in compliance at a regional bank, which meant she spent her days doing something I had spent most of my life doing quietly in the background, looking for inconsistencies, finding patterns, recognizing when something didn't add up. I had hesitated before calling her, not because I didn't trust her, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to say everything out loud. To admit that my own daughter had become part of something this calculated. But after what Ethan had told me, I knew I needed help. Real help. So I called her. "Aunt Alice," she said, surprised. "Everything okay?" I almost said yes. It would have been easier, but I didn't. "No," I said simply. "I need you." There was a pause on the line. "Tell me where you are," she said. An hour later, Rachel was sitting across from me at my dining table, her laptop open, a notepad beside her, her expression focused but not intrusive. I appreciated that. She didn't start with sympathy. She started with facts. Walk me through everything she said. And I did. The dinner, the spit, the accounts, the emails, the withdrawals, the conversation I had overheard. I didn't leave anything out. By the time I finished, the room felt heavier, not with judgment, but with reality. Rachel didn't speak right away. She simply nodded once, then turned her attention to the documents I had already shared with Margaret. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's take this piece by piece." For the next 2 hours, we worked side by side, not as aunt and niece, but as two people trying to understand something that had been deliberately hidden. She moved quickly, faster than I could have on my own, cross-referencing transactions, tracing vendor names, checking registration records. And then she stopped. "Here," she said, turning her laptop slightly toward me. On the screen was a business name, a company listed as one of the vendors that had received multiple payments tied to property renovations. "Does this look familiar?" she asked. I leaned closer. The name didn't mean anything to me. "No," I said. "Should it?" Rachel tapped a few keys, pulling up additional information. "It should," she said. A moment later, a profile appeared. A social media page. A photo. And there she was, Chloe Sanders, smiling, standing in front of a house that wasn't hers. The same woman who had sat at my daughter's dinner table sipping wine while pretending everything was normal. I felt my stomach drop. "That's her," I said quietly. Rachel nodded. "She's listed as the owner of this company," she said, "but the business was only registered 6 months ago, and the address," she paused, clicking again, "is linked to a shared workspace. No real operational footprint." I stared at the screen. "So it's fake," I said. "Not entirely," Rachel replied. "It exists, but it's not what it claims to be. A shell," I said. She glanced at me, a small hint of respect in her eyes. "Exactly." I leaned back in my chair, the pieces beginning to lock into place. "They created it," I said slowly, "to funnel payments." Rachel nodded again. "That's what it looks like." "And Lauren knew," I added. It wasn't a question. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened another file. "Let's confirm that," she said. She scrolled through a series of email records, ones Margaret had flagged earlier but hadn't fully analyzed yet. "Look at the language," Rachel said, pointing to a specific message. "This one is from your account or appears to be. But compare it to this one." She pulled up another email. A legitimate one. Written by me. The difference was subtle, but it was there. Word choice. Sentence structure. Tone. "They mimicked you," Rachel said. "But not perfectly." I felt a cold wave move through me. "How many?" I asked. "At least 8 confirmed," she replied. "Possibly more. And the payments. Approved through those emails," she said. "Which means whoever sent them knew exactly how your system worked." I closed my eyes for a moment. Lauren had watched me manage those systems for years. She knew. She had always known. When I opened my eyes again, Rachel was watching me carefully. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer honestly." I nodded. "Do you believe your daughter was aware of all of this?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Heavy, unavoidable. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect what little remained of the image I had of her, but that part of me was getting smaller. Every day. "I think," I began slowly, "she may not have started it." Rachel waited, but she knew I finished. Rachel nodded once. "That's what the evidence suggests," she said. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she spoke again. "There's more," she said. I looked at her. "What?" She turned the laptop back toward me. This she said. On the screen was a transaction history, different account, different pattern, but familiar. Too familiar. My breath caught. "The college fund?" I said. Rachel nodded. I traced the withdrawals, she said. "They don't go directly to Lauren or Brandon. They're routed through an intermediary account." "Whose?" I asked. She clicked once more. And there it was. Chloe again. I felt something inside me harden. Not crack. Not break. Harden? They used her for everything I said. Or she was part of it from the beginning, Rachel replied. Either way, the result was the same. This wasn't just carelessness. It wasn't just bad decisions. It was coordinated, planned, executed. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel closed her laptop gently. "Aunt Alice," she said, her voice softer. "Now you need to understand something." I looked at her. "This isn't just about the house," she continued. "This is a strategy." I nodded slowly. "I know," I said. "They were building pressure," she added. "Financially, emotionally, legally." I thought about the dinner again. The setup, the confrontation, the spit. "They wanted me to react," I said. "Yes," Rachel replied. "Because if you had, they would have used it," I finished. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew. I stood up and walked to the window, my reflection faint in the glass. For the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel uncertain. I felt certain. Not about what had happened, but about what needed to happen next. I turned back to Rachel. "They think they're ahead," I said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "Are they?" she asked. I shook my head. "No," I said. "They just don't know I've caught up." Rachel smiled faintly. "Then what's your next move?" I didn't hesitate. "I finish what I started," I said, because the truth was, this was never just about selling a house. It was about exposing a lie. And once you see the full shape of a lie, You don't just walk away from it. You dismantle it, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hide behind. The knock on my door came just before noon. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't polite. It was sharp, rapid, insistent, like whoever stood on the other side wasn't asking to be let in. They expected it. I didn't rush. I stood from the kitchen table, wiped my hands on a towel, and walked toward the door with a calm I hadn't felt in days. By the time I opened it, I already knew who I would see. Lauren. Her hair was pulled back in a loose, hurried knot. Her makeup was smudged as if she had tried to fix it in the car and given up halfway through. But it wasn't the disheveled appearance that caught my attention. It was her eyes. Red. Not just from crying, from anger. "Are you serious right now?" she said the moment the door opened, not waiting for an invitation, pushing past me into the house. I stepped aside without a word and closed the door behind her. "If you're going to raise your voice," I said calmly, "you can leave." She turned to face me, stunned for a second, not by what I said, but by how I said it. Flat, controlled, different. "I'm not here to argue," she said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm here to fix this." I walked back toward the living room and gestured toward the chair across from me. "Then sit," I said. She hesitated, then dropped into the seat, her hands already moving, wringing together, then releasing, then gripping the edge of the chair as if she needed something solid to hold on to. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I studied her quietly, and for just a second, I saw her. Not the woman who had stood across from me at that dinner, not the voice on the phone sharp and defensive, but the girl she used to be. The one who came to me when things fell apart, the one who cried at my door with a suitcase in her hand, and for a dangerous moment, I almost softened. "Mom," she said, her voice quieter, now more measured. "We need to talk about the house." There it was. Always the house. "We are talking," I replied. She exhaled as if trying to steady herself. "I didn't mean what happened the other night," she said. "I was upset. Things got out of control." I didn't respond, because apologies that come attached to conditions aren't really apologies. "I've been under a lot of pressure," she continued. "You don't understand everything that's been going on." "You're right," I said. She looked up surprised. "I don't understand everything I added. That's part of the problem." She flinched slightly. "I was trying to protect my family," she said quickly. "From what I asked." The question hung there. Simple. Direct. She hesitated. "From instability," she said finally. "From not knowing what's ours and what isn't." I nodded slowly. "And the way you chose to handle that," I said, "was to humiliate me in front of your children." Her jaw tightened. "I said I didn't mean that part," she snapped. "Why are you holding on to that like it's the only thing that matters? Because it wasn't the only thing. It was just the moment that made everything else impossible to ignore." "This isn't about one moment," I said. "Then what is it about?" she demanded. I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. "This is about a pattern," I said. "A pattern of decisions that put you and your children at risk." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood up and walked to the desk in the corner of the room. I picked up a folder. When I turned back, her expression had changed. Not yet fear, but something close. "What is that?" she asked. I placed the folder on the table between us. "Information," I said. She didn't touch it. "About what?" she asked. "About the house," I replied. She let out a small, frustrated laugh. "Of course it is," she said. "Everything comes back to that with you." "Open it," I said. She hesitated. Then slowly she reached forward and flipped the folder open. Her eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then the third. I watched her closely. The shift was subtle at first, a slight tightening around her eyes, a pause in her breathing, and then recognition. "What is this?" she asked, her voice lower now. "You tell me," I said. She flipped through more pages faster this time. Emails, transactions, vendor names, dates, amounts. "I don't know what I'm looking at," she said quickly, but her tone had changed. It wasn't confident anymore, it was defensive. "You're looking at financial activity connected to the property," I said. She shook her head. "I didn't do any of this," she said. "I didn't say you did," I replied. Her eyes snapped up to mine. "Then why are you showing me this?" she demanded. I held her gaze. "Because you're connected to it," I said. Her breath caught. "For God's sake, Mom," she said, her voice rising again. "You're twisting things. Brandon handles most of that stuff." "I don't—" She stopped. Too quickly. Too abruptly. I saw it. The moment she realized she had said too much. "Brandon handles what I asked quietly." She looked away. "Just the house stuff," she muttered. "The house stuff," I repeated. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "And the college fund," I asked. Her head snapped back toward me. "What about it?" she said too fast. I didn't answer. I simply reached into the folder and pulled out another page and slid it toward her. She looked at it. And this time, there was no mistaking the reaction. Her face went pale. Just for a second. But it was enough. "That's not," she started. "Finish that sentence," I said. She swallowed. "That's not what you think," she said. "Then tell me what it is," I replied. She didn't. Instead, she pushed the papers back toward me. "I'm not doing this," she said, standing up abruptly. "You're blowing everything out of proportion." "Sit down," I said. "No," she snapped. "You're trying to trap me into something." I stood up slowly. "I'm trying to understand how my daughter justified taking money meant for her own children," I said. Her eyes widened. "I didn't take anything," she shouted. "Then explain the withdrawals," I said. "I can't explain something I didn't do," she fired back. "Then explain why your friend Chloe is connected to both the vendor payments and the intermediary account," I said. Silence. Real silence. Not anger. Not denial. Just stillness. She stared at me. And in that moment, I saw it. The truth. Not spoken, but present. "You knew," I said quietly. She shook her head, but it wasn't convincing. "I didn't," she started. "You knew," I repeated. Her shoulders sagged slightly. "Just for a second." And then, "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said. There it was. Not innocence, not denial, but justification. I felt something inside me settle. Cold. Final. "What wasn't?" I asked. She ran a hand through her hair, pacing now. "We just needed leverage," she said, "to get you to let go." Leverage. The word landed heavier than I expected. "And the dinner?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "That wasn't planned," she said. "Not exactly, but it wasn't denied either." I nodded slowly. And in that moment, whatever hope I had left was gone. "Leave," I said. She froze. What she asked. "You heard me," I said. "Leave." Her expression hardened instantly. "You're really doing this," she said. "Yes." Over this, she demanded. "No," I replied. Because of this, she stared at me for a long moment, then grabbed her purse. "You're making a mistake," she said coldly. Maybe I said. She walked toward the door, paused, and without turning back, she said, "You'll regret choosing money over your own daughter." I didn't respond, because she still didn't understand. This had never been about money. It had been about truth, about respect, about a line that should never have been crossed. The door closed behind her, and this time, I didn't feel sadness. I felt certainty, because the woman who walked out of my house just now was no longer someone I needed to protect. She was someone I needed to hold accountable. The legal notice went out the next morning. There's something strangely quiet about decisive action. No fanfare, no dramatic shift in the world outside your window. Just a series of documents, signatures, and confirmations that move forward whether your heart is ready or not. By noon, Margaret called to confirm delivery. "They've received it," she said. "Officially." I stood at my kitchen counter, one hand resting against the cool surface, absorbing the weight of that statement. "And their response?" I asked. "Predictable," she replied. "Initial shock, then anger. And now, strategy." I let out a slow breath. "Go on. Brandon has retained counsel," she continued. "They're preparing to challenge the termination of occupancy and claim that the property was verbally promised as a permanent gift to Lauren." I almost smiled. Not because it was amusing, but because it was exactly what I expected. "Do they have anything in writing?" I asked. "No," Margaret said, "and that's their problem." I nodded. Still, she added, "They're not relying on documentation alone. They're suggesting something else." I straightened slightly. "What?" "That you may not be acting in full capacity," she said carefully. There it was, the line they had been inching toward. "They're questioning my competency," I said. "Yes." I was quiet for a moment, not shocked, not even surprised, just aware. Because now everything fit together completely. The pressure, the emotional setup, the attempt to provoke me at dinner. If I had reacted the way they wanted, if I had lashed out, lost control, created a scene, they would have had exactly what they needed. Evidence. A narrative. An opening. "They're building a case," I said. "Yes," Margaret replied, "but it's weak. For now." I added. She didn't argue with that. "We'll respond formally," she continued. "In the meantime, you need to be prepared for a deposition." I closed my eyes briefly. "A deposition," I repeated. "Yes. They'll want to question you directly. Establish a record. Test your responses. Test my memory," I said. "Among other things." I walked slowly to the living room and sat down. "All right," I said. "Then we prepare." There was a brief pause on the line. "Alice." Margaret said gently, "This won't be comfortable." I almost laughed. "Nothing about this has been comfortable," I replied. After we ended the call, I sat in silence for a long time. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood what was coming. They weren't just going to challenge my decisions. They were going to challenge me. My judgment, my memory, my stability, my right to control what was legally mine. And the worst part? They would do it using the same tools I had spent my life trusting. Words, interpretation, perception. Later that afternoon, Rachel came by again. She didn't knock this time, just walked in after I opened the door, her expression already focused. "I heard," she said. I nodded. They're going after competency, I replied. She set her bag down and crossed her arms. That was always the next move, she said. If they couldn't control the asset, they'd try to discredit the owner. I studied her for a moment. You sound very certain, I said. I've seen it before, she replied. Different situations. Same strategy. I leaned back slightly. Then tell me what to expect. She didn't hesitate. They'll be polite, she said. At first, respectful, almost overly so. And then I asked. They'll start small, she continued. Dates, details, minor inconsistencies. They'll look for hesitation, confusion, anything they can frame as uncertainty. I nodded slowly. And if they find it, they build on it, she said. Turn it into a pattern. Suggest decline. Imply vulnerability. I let that settle. And if they don't find it? I asked. Rachel's lips curved slightly. Then they look for something else, she said. But either way, their goal is the same. To make me look unreliable, I finished. Exactly. I stood up and walked toward the bookshelf along the far wall. For years, it had held everything from old accounting manuals to photo albums, but tucked between them was something else. A small worn envelope. I hadn't looked at it in years, not because it wasn't important, but because it was. I pulled it out carefully. Rachel watched me. What is that? She asked. I turned it over in my hands. Something my husband left me, I said quietly. I opened it and unfolded the paper inside. Daniel's handwriting. Strong, steady, unmistakable. I read it silently at first. Then, without thinking, I spoke the words out loud. Alice. I began, my voice softer now. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to remind you of something you've always struggled with. I paused. Rachel didn't move. You give too much, I continued. Not because people deserve it, but because you believe they will eventually. A lump formed in my throat. But love without boundaries isn't kindness, I read. It's surrender. The room felt still. Protect what we built, I went on. Not just the money, but the principles behind it. Because one day someone may test them. I lowered the letter slightly. He wrote this years ago, I said, after we helped a friend who took advantage of us. Rachel nodded slowly. He knew, she said. Not specifically, I replied. But enough. I folded the letter carefully and held it in my hands for a moment longer. Then I looked up. I'm not going to lose this, I said. Rachel met my gaze. I know, she replied. The deposition was scheduled 3 days later. It took place in a conference room neutral controlled designed to feel professional and impersonal at the same time. Margaret sat beside me. Across the table sat Brandon's attorney. And Brandon, he looked different, less confident, more tense. But the arrogance was still there, hidden beneath the surface. The questioning began exactly as Rachel had predicted, simple, routine. My name, my age, my occupation. How long have you managed financial assets? The attorney asked. Over 30 years, I replied. Do you consider yourself detail-oriented? He asked. Yes. Would you say you rely heavily on routine? I would say I rely on structure, I corrected. He nodded, making a note. Then came the shift. Subtle. Gradual. Do you recall the specific date you authorized the renovation payments in March? He asked. I did not authorize those payments, I said. But the emails originated from your account, he pointed out. Yes, I replied. But I did not write them. And how can you be certain of that? He asked. I held his gaze. Because I know how I write, I said, and because I have documentation to support that claim. Margaret slid a folder forward. The attorney glanced at it. Didn't open it. Not yet. They moved on. Dates, amounts, details. Each question designed to probe, to test, to find something, anything. But I didn't rush. I didn't guess. When I didn't recall something exactly, I said so. When I did, I answered clearly, and through it all, I stayed steady. At one point, the attorney leaned back slightly. Mrs. Bennett, he said, would you agree that your relationship with your daughter has become strained? Yes, I said. And that this strain may be influencing your decisions regarding the property? No, I replied. He raised an eyebrow. Not at all. He asked. No, I said again. My decisions are based on documented financial misconduct and legal agreements, not emotion. There was a pause, a longer one. Then he nodded. And for the first time, I saw it. Not defeat, but recognition. They weren't getting what they wanted. The deposition ended shortly after. As we stood to leave, Brandon avoided my eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because for the first time since all of this began, the balance had shifted. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough for them to realize I wasn't the woman they thought I was. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't confused. And I certainly wasn't someone they could push into surrender. As I stepped out of that room, one thought settled firmly in my mind. They had tried to question my strength, and all they had done was prove it. The first crack didn't come from Brandon. It came from Chloe. I should have expected that. People like Brandon build pressure. They hold the center. They push forward until something breaks. But people like Chloe, they fracture first. 3 days after the deposition, Margaret called me again. Her tone was different this time. Not urgent, not tense, controlled, but with something underneath it. We've had a development, she said. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing the latest property listing updates. The house was already attracting interest, strong interest. The kind that moves quickly. What kind of development, I asked. Chloe Sanders, she said. She's reached out through her attorney. I went still. And I asked. She wants to cooperate. The word landed quietly, but its impact was anything but. Cooperate how, I asked. She's willing to provide records, communications, and a statement, Margaret said. In exchange for reduced exposure. Of course she was. I leaned back in my chair slowly. She's protecting herself, I said. Yes, Margaret replied. But in doing so, she's opening the door. I stared at the window across the room, my reflection faint in the glass. Do we take it? I asked. There was a brief pause. From a legal standpoint, Margaret said. Absolutely. And from a personal one, I asked. That's not my lane, she replied gently. I almost smiled. Fair enough. Set the meeting, I said. It happened the following afternoon. A neutral office. Glass walls. Minimal distractions. Chloe sat across from us, her posture stiff. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if she were trying to hold herself together. She looked different. Not the polished version I had seen at the dinner table. Not the confident, smiling woman who had sipped wine while everything unraveled around her. This version was smaller, nervous, exposed. She didn't meet my eyes at first. Thank you for coming, Margaret said professionally. Chloe nodded slightly. Yeah, she murmured. There was a pause. Then Margaret spoke again. "You understand why we're here," she said. Chloe swallowed. "Yes." "And you're prepared to provide a full account?" Margaret asked. Chloe hesitated, then nodded again. "Yes." Margaret glanced at me briefly. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Go ahead." Chloe took a breath. "It started with Brandon," she said. "Of course it did. He came to me about 6 months ago," she continued. "Said he had an opportunity, something that could help him and Lauren stabilize things financially." Stabilize. The word felt hollow now. What kind of opportunity, Margaret asked. Chloe looked down at her hands. "He wanted to set up a company," she said. "A legitimate one on paper, something that could be used for contracting work." "And was it legitimate?" Margaret asked. Chloe shook her head. "Not really," she said. "It existed, but it wasn't doing real work." I felt my jaw tighten slightly, and the payments Margaret pressed. Chloe exhaled. "They were routed through that company," she said. "Renovations, maintenance, upgrades, all tied to the house." "And were those services actually performed?" Margaret asked. "Some," Chloe admitted, "but not at the scale or cost that was being billed." There it was. Not just deception, inflation, exploitation. Who authorized the payments, Margaret asked. Chloe hesitated. "Then emails," she said. "From Alice's account. My account. And who wrote those emails?" Margaret asked. Chloe's eyes flicked up briefly, then back down. "Brandon," she said. The room went quiet. "Did Lauren know?" Margaret asked. That was the question. The one that mattered most. Chloe didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around each other. Then slowly, "Yes." The word was soft, but it landed like something heavy and final. She didn't write the emails, Chloe added quickly, but she knew what was happening. She knew the structure, the plan. And what was the plan? Margaret asked. Chloe exhaled again. "To create pressure," she said. I felt something inside me go still. "What kind of pressure?" Margaret continued. "Financial, emotional," Chloe said. "The idea was, if Alice felt like things were already shifting, like control was slipping, it would be easier to push her into transferring ownership." I stared at Chloe. Push her? How? I asked. It was the first time I had spoken. My voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. Chloe looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes. Not confidence, not manipulation. Guilt. "She said you wouldn't respond to logic," Chloe said quietly, "that it had to be emotional." Emotional. I almost laughed, but I didn't. "And the dinner?" I asked. Chloe flinched. "That was part of it," she admitted. My chest tightened. "Explain," I said. She hesitated again. Then Brandon suggested creating a situation where you'd feel cornered, she said. Where you'd either give in or react. "React?" How? I asked. She swallowed. "Lose control," she said. The room felt colder. "And if I had?" I asked. Chloe's voice dropped. "They were planning to record it," she said. Margaret stiffened slightly beside me. "Record it," she repeated. Chloe nodded. "Use it as leverage," she said, "to question your judgment, your stability, your ability to manage your own assets." There it was, the full picture, clear, complete, calculated. I leaned back slowly, my hands resting in my lap. "So the dinner wasn't just a confrontation," I said. Chloe shook her head. "No," she said. It was a setup. Silence filled the room. Not the kind that invites more words, the kind that confirms them. I thought about that night again. The tension, the pressure, the way everything had escalated so quickly. It hadn't been chaos. It had been design. And the spit I asked quietly. Chloe's eyes flickered. That wasn't planned, she said. Not exactly, but again, not denied. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in pain, not in anger, but in recognition. Because at that point, nothing surprised me anymore. When I opened my eyes again, Chloe was watching me, carefully. I didn't think it would go that far, she said. I met her gaze. You didn't stop it either, I replied. She looked away. No, she admitted. Margaret stepped in. Do you have documentation to support everything you've said, she asked. Chloe nodded quickly. Yes. Messages, emails, transaction records. All of it. Then we'll need copies, Margaret said. You'll have them, Chloe replied. The meeting ended shortly after. Chloe left quietly, without looking back. And when the door closed behind her, the room felt different. Not lighter, but resolved. Margaret turned to me. Well, she said. I nodded slowly. It's done, I said. Not the case. Not yet. But the doubt, the uncertainty, the questions I had been asking myself since that dinner. Gone. Replaced with something else. Something solid. Because now I knew. Without hesitation. Without illusion. My daughter hadn't just crossed a line, she had planned to erase it completely. And the only reason she hadn't succeeded was because I hadn't reacted the way she expected. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window once more. The world outside looked exactly the same, but I wasn't. Because now, this wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine, it was about exposing what they had tried to do, and making sure they never had the chance to do it again. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon. Neutral ground. That's what Margaret called it. A conference room in a quiet office building. Nothing personal, nothing familiar. Just a long table, a few chairs, and enough distance between people to make sure no one could pretend this was still a family conversation. Because it wasn't. By the time I arrived, Margaret was already there, organizing documents into neat, deliberate stacks. Rachel sat beside her laptop open, her expression focused but calm. Across the room, Lauren and Brandon. For a moment, I simply stood there, not moving, not speaking, just observing. Lauren looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but something about her posture had changed. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly now seemed forced, like she was holding herself upright out of sheer determination. Brandon, on the other hand, still leaned back in his chair with that same carefully constructed composure. But there was tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes. They both knew. Not everything, but enough. I walked to my seat slowly and sat down. No greeting, no acknowledgement. There was nothing left to exchange in that way. Margaret began. Thank you all for being here, she said, her voice professional, controlled. The purpose of this meeting is to address the current legal and financial matters regarding the property and associated accounts. Straightforward. Clean. Lauren shifted in her seat. This is ridiculous, she muttered under her breath. I didn't respond. Margaret continued. We've reviewed the claims made by your counsel, she said, glancing briefly at Brandon. Specifically, the assertion that the property was intended as a permanent gift and that Ms. Bennett's recent actions are influenced by emotional instability. Lauren flinched slightly at the wording. Brandon said nothing. Margaret folded her hands. "We are prepared to respond to those claims," she said. A pause. Then she turned to me. "Alice," she said. I nodded once and reached for the folder in front of me. I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize. I simply opened it and began. "These," I said, sliding the first set of documents across the table, "are records of financial transactions tied to the property over the past 6 months." Lauren didn't touch them. Brandon did. He glanced down, flipping through a few pages quickly. His expression didn't change, but his hand slowed. "These payments," I continued, "were authorized through emails sent from my account." Lauren let out a short, sharp breath. "Exactly," she said. "So what's the issue?" I looked at her. "The issue," I said calmly, "is that I didn't send them." Silence. Brandon set the papers down. "That's an accusation," he said. "It's a fact," I replied. Margaret slid another folder forward. "Language analysis, timestamp discrepancies, and access logs support that conclusion," she said. Brandon didn't reach for it this time. He already knew. Lauren looked between us, her eyes moving quickly, searching for something, an opening, an explanation, a way to redirect. "There has to be some mistake," she said. "Maybe someone hacked Lauren," I said. She stopped, because I had never said her name like that before. Not cold, not final, but close. Close enough to truth that she couldn't pretend she didn't hear it. "There's no mistake," I said. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. I reached into the folder again, pulled out another set of documents. "These are the vendor records," I said. "Specifically, payments routed through a company registered under Chloe Sanders." At the name, Brandon's jaw tightened. Lauren froze. "That doesn't mean anything," she said quickly. "It means everything," I replied. Rachel turned her laptop toward them. "Registration date," she said. "Ownership records. Financial routing." Lauren stared at the screen. Her face paled. Just slightly. "But enough. And this," I continued, sliding another page forward, "is the transaction history for the college fund." "That did it." Lauren's eyes snapped up to mine. "You said you weren't going to," she started. "I said nothing," I interrupted. Her voice dropped. "You're bringing the kids into this." "I'm protecting them," I said. Brandon leaned forward now, his composure cracking just a little. "You're making this bigger than it is," he said. "These are just numbers." "No," I said, cutting him off. "These are choices." The room went still. Margaret didn't speak. Rachel didn't move. Lauren's breathing quickened. "And Brandon." Brandon leaned back again. But this time it wasn't confidence. It was calculation. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "you can't prove intent." I held his gaze. "Yes, I can." Margaret slid one final document across the table, Chloe's statement. Brandon didn't touch it. Lauren did. Her hands trembled as she opened it. She read silently at first, then faster. Then she stopped. The color drained from her face. "This isn't," she whispered. "It is, I said." She shook her head. "No." "She wouldn't." "She did," I replied. Lauren's hands dropped to the table. The paper slipped from her fingers. And in that moment, everything changed. Because there was no more space for denial, no more room for deflection, just truth. Raw. Unavoidable. Brandon stood up abruptly. "This is useless," he said. "We're done here." "No," Margaret said firmly. "You're not." He paused. Just for a second. Then turned back. "What do you want?" he asked. Not what is this about? Not what happened. What do you want? I almost smiled. Because finally, we were speaking the same language. "I want accountability," I said. Lauren let out a broken sound. "Mom," she started. I held up a hand. "No," I said quietly. "You don't get to call me that right now." She went silent. And for the first time since I had walked into that room, I saw it. Not anger, not entitlement, fear. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked, at the woman she had become, at the choices she had made, at the distance between who she was and who I thought she was. "The house sale proceeds," I said. Her eyes filled instantly. "You can't." I said. "And I will." She shook her head, tears beginning to fall. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked. I didn't answer right away because that question, that one, still hurt, but not enough to change what needed to be done. "You should have thought about that," I said finally. She flinched, like the words had physically struck her. Brandon scoffed. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, but there was no conviction behind it anymore, just frustration, desperation, because the truth had done what it always does. It had stripped everything else away. Lauren looked at me again, and this time, there was no anger, no defiance, just something broken. "Please," she whispered. The word hung in the air. Fragile. Too late. I stood up slowly, gathering the folders, closing the space between us. "This isn't punishment," I said quietly. "It's consequence." And with that, I walked out, leaving behind the room, the documents, the lies, and the version of my daughter I could no longer pretend existed. Because some truths don't just change a situation, they change you. And there was no going back. The silence that followed was different. Not the heavy, suffocating silence that had filled my home the night of the dinner. Not the sharp, tense silence of legal rooms and confrontation. This one was quieter, wider, like the space left behind after something finally collapses. For the first few weeks after the meeting, I didn't hear from Lauren. No calls, no messages, nothing. And for the first time in years, I didn't reach out either. That was the hardest part. Not the legal process, not the exposure, but the absence. Because motherhood, once it becomes a habit, doesn't just disappear when it's no longer safe. It lingers. It waits. It whispers that maybe, just maybe, you should check in. Make sure they're okay. Offer something. Anything. But I had learned something by then. Love without boundaries doesn't heal. It enables. So I stayed still. The house sold faster than expected. Within 2 weeks, we had multiple offers, strong ones. Families who saw the same potential I had once seen when I bought it for Lauren and the children. Families who wanted to build something real, not exploit something already built. I accepted one that felt right, not just financially, but emotionally. A young couple with 2 small children, hopeful, grounded, grateful. It mattered to me more than I expected. The closing process was smooth, efficient, final. And when it was done, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release, like I had been holding on to something long after it had stopped being mine to carry. Margaret handled the remaining legal matters, restitution claims, documentation, formal closures. Brandon tried to push back once more briefly, but without leverage, without control, without Chloe's silence. He didn't get far. And then just as quickly as he had entered Lauren's life, he disappeared from it. I heard about it indirectly. Not from Lauren, from Rachel. He left, she said one afternoon, sitting across from me with her usual calm. Left, I repeated. Packed up. Walked out, she said. From what I've heard, things got difficult. Difficult. Another soft word for something harsher. Legal pressure tends to do that, I said. Rachel nodded. And financial exposure, she added. I didn't ask where he went. I didn't need to. People like Brandon don't disappear. They relocate, find new opportunities, new resources. What mattered was that he was no longer standing beside my daughter. But that didn't bring the relief I thought it might. Because without him, there were no more excuses. A month passed, then another. And still, nothing. Until one afternoon my phone buzzed. A message. From Lauren. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. I know I don't deserve a response, but I needed to say something. I didn't reply. I kept reading. Everything fell apart after that meeting. Brandon left. The accounts are frozen. I lost the house. I lost everything. I exhaled slowly, not in satisfaction, not in regret, just acknowledgement. I thought I understood what I was doing. I thought I was just taking control, building something for my kids. My grip tightened slightly around the phone, but I see now. I wasn't building anything. I was taking. From you. From them. I closed my eyes briefly, because those words, they mattered. Not because they fixed anything, but because they were honest. For the first time in a long time. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect help. I just needed you to know. I see it now. The message ended there. No request, no demand, no manipulation. Just truth. I didn't respond. Not that day. Not the next. Because understanding something doesn't undo it. And I wasn't ready to blur that line again. But I didn't ignore it either. I sat with it. Let it settle. Let it exist without rushing to define what it meant. In the meantime, I focused on what I could control. The children. Ethan and Sophie. Through Margaret, we finalized the trust structure. Protected, monitored, untouchable by anyone but them when the time came. And until then, their needs were met. Quietly, consistently, without Lauren having direct access. It wasn't punishment. It was protection. A few weeks later, I saw them again. Not at a family dinner, not in a house filled with tension, but at a small park on the edge of town. Rachel had arranged it carefully, neutral, safe, controlled. Ethan spotted me first. Grandma, he called, running toward me with that same energy that hadn't changed despite everything. I knelt down, opening my arms as he reached me. Sophie followed close behind, wrapping herself around my side. I missed you, she said softly. I missed you too, I replied. And for a moment, everything else faded. No legal battles, no betrayal, just that connection. Simple, real. Lauren stood a few feet away. She didn't approach, didn't interrupt, just watched. And when our eyes met, I saw it. Not the entitlement, not the anger, but something else, something quieter. Regret. We didn't speak that day. Not really, just a few polite words. Careful, measured, like two people learning how to exist in the same space again, without pretending nothing had happened. And that was enough, for now, because real healing doesn't start with forgiveness. It starts with truth. And for the first time since all of this began, the truth was finally clear. Not just to me, but to her. And maybe, just maybe, that was where everything could begin again. Not the way it was before, but in a way that was real. A year changes more than you expect. Not all at once. Not in dramatic sweeping moments that announce themselves like the turning of a page, but slowly through quiet mornings, small decisions, and the absence of chaos where it once lived. A year ago, I walked out of a house that held everything I thought I had built for my daughter. Today, I wake up in a smaller home, one I chose for myself, and that difference matters. My new place isn't grand. It doesn't need to be. It's quiet, filled with light in the mornings, and just enough space to hold what I've decided to keep, not just physically, but emotionally. For the first time in a long time, my life feels mine. I joined a small women's group a few months after everything settled. Not a formal organization, just a circle of women who meet once a week, share stories, listen without judgment, and remind each other that it's never too late to redefine what strength looks like. Some of them have stories that echo mine. Others? Far worse. And yet in that room, there's no competition over pain. Only understanding. I don't speak every week. But when I do, I speak honestly. About what happened. About what I ignored. About what I finally refused to ignore, and every time I finish, there's always someone who nods, just slightly, like they've been waiting for someone else to say it out loud. That love is not the same as surrender, that giving without limits doesn't make you kind, it makes you vulnerable, and that sometimes the most difficult thing a mother can do is step back. Not because she stopped loving her child, but because she finally started respecting herself. Lauren and I, we are not what we used to be, and we never will be. That took me a long time to accept. At first, I thought healing meant returning to something familiar, rebuilding what was broken until it looked the same as before. But that's not what happened, and now I'm grateful for that, because what we have now is honest. Fragile, yes. Careful, absolutely, but real. She started therapy not long after that message she sent me. I didn't suggest it. I didn't push her toward it. It was her decision, and that mattered. She found a job, nothing glamorous, nothing that matches the image she once tried so hard to maintain, but it's steady, grounded, earned. She's learning something she had forgotten, or maybe never fully understood, what it means to build instead of take. We don't speak every day, sometimes not even every week. But when we do, there's no performance, no hidden agenda, just conversation. Careful, measured, honest. The children visit me regularly now. Ethan has grown taller, his voice beginning to shift, his questions becoming more thoughtful, more aware of the world around him. Sophie still draws, still brings me pictures of the two of us holding hands. But now, she adds more detail, more color, more understanding. They don't ask the same questions anymore. Not about the house, not about what happened, because children, they adapt. They don't forget. But they learn how to carry things differently, and I've made sure of one thing. They never feel like they lost something because of me, because they didn't. What they lost was something that was never stable to begin with, and what they gained was something far more important. Security, not tied to a place, but to a person who will not disappear when things become difficult. Lauren understands that now, or at least, she's starting to. The first time she came to my house alone, it was quiet. No children, no distractions, just the two of us. She stood at the door for a moment before knocking. I watched her through the window, not rushing, not avoiding, just observing, the same way I had learned to do over the past year. When I opened the door, she didn't speak right away. She didn't step inside without being invited. She didn't assume anything. And that was new. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," I replied. A pause. "Then, can I come in?" 3 simple words, but they carried more weight than anything she had said in months. I stepped aside. "Yes." She walked in slowly, her eyes moving around the space, not judging, not assessing, just taking it in. "It's nice," she said. "Thank you," I replied. We sat down in the living room, across from each other, not close, not distant, just present. "I've been wanting to talk to you," she said. "I know," I replied. She nodded. I didn't know how she admitted. "That makes 2 of us," I said. A small, fragile smile appeared on her face, then disappeared. I've been going through everything she said. In therapy, in my head, over and over again. I didn't interrupt. I thought I understood what I was doing, she continued. I told myself it was about control, about stability, about making sure my kids had what they needed. Her voice tightened slightly, but the truth is, I was scared. I watched her carefully, scared of losing everything again, she said, like I did after my first marriage, and instead of facing that fear, I tried to control it. She looked up at me then. "And I turned you into something you were never supposed to be," she said. I didn't respond right away, because I needed to hear the rest. "A resource," she added quietly. The word hung there, not as an accusation, not as a defense, but as a truth she could no longer avoid. "I'm sorry," she said, and this time, there was no condition attached. No explanation trying to soften it, just accountability. I let the silence sit between us for a moment, not to punish her, but to honor what she had just said, because real apologies deserve space. "I believe you," I said finally. Her eyes filled slightly. "But believing you doesn't mean forgetting," I continued. She nodded quickly. "I know," she said. "And it doesn't mean things go back to the way they were," I added. "I don't want that," she said. That caught me off guard. "You don't?" I asked. She shook her head. "No," she said. "Because the way things were led us here." I studied her for a moment, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something familiar. Not the girl she used to be, but a version of her that was aware, honest, trying. "I don't know what this looks like moving forward," I said. "Neither do I," she admitted. "But we'll figure it out," I added, slowly, carefully, truthfully, and that was enough. Not a perfect ending, not a full circle, but a beginning, a different one. Because the truth is, Some relationships don't survive unchanged. They evolve, or they end. And in our case, we didn't go back. We moved forward, with boundaries, with clarity, with respect, the kind that should have been there all along. And as I sat there across from my daughter, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Losing everything is sometimes the only way to see what actually matters, and once you see it, you never let it go again. There are moments in life when love asks something of us that feels impossible. Not sacrifice, not patience, but truth. And the truth is this love without boundaries is not love, it's permission. For years, I believed that being a good mother meant giving more forgiving faster and holding on longer than I should. I thought that if I just kept showing up, kept supporting, kept understanding, everything would eventually fall back into place. But it doesn't work that way, because people don't always rise to meet your love. Sometimes they learn to rely on it without respecting it. And that's where the line must be drawn. What I learned, what I hope you take from this, is that protecting yourself is not selfish. Saying enough is not cruel. And walking away from someone you love doesn't mean you stopped loving them. It means you finally chose yourself too. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have forgiven sooner? Or would you have done the same? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read your stories, and they mean more than you know. And if this story touched you in any way, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories like this about truth, strength, and the quiet courage it takes to stand up even when it hurts. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stop giving what was never truly valued.